We must speak the truth about terror. Let us never tolerate outrageous conspiracy theories, malicious lies that attempt to shift the blame away from the terrorists themselves.
Take your own advice. What happens? I tell you what happens. Blam!
I have a window that looks directly at the World Trade Center, and I saw...
No delusion!
Shit's getting way too complicated for me.
Harry, if I'd your hair, I'd be president.
Welcome to the AnteDote. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothkushel.
It is Thursday, September 26th, 2024, and we're back for the first time in a bit. We wanted to take some time to talk about the current elements of the current political landscape and where we find ourselves at, both in terms of actual current events going on now, but also in terms of maybe a bigger picture conversation about some of the trends that are going on politically and otherwise that figure into maybe what you could call anti-two-party politics, anti-establishment politics, and figuring that in with the politics of the current moment as it relates to obviously the upcoming presidential election and a number of other things. And on that front, Jeremy, this past week you attended an interesting event in Colorado that helped inspire the conversation that we're going to have here. Would you like to talk a little bit about where you were last week and what this event was?
Yes. So last week I went to what was called the Independent National Convention 24 or Inc. 24. It was the second version or the second time of it. Last year was the first. I think it was in Austin, Texas last year. And it was on my radar. And I saw that it might be interesting to go to, especially in terms of maybe like political interventions. Tulsi Gabbard was going to be there. It was like early-ish in the RFK Jr. campaign, but I was not able to make it last year. And so this year signed up actually for the whole family to go when it was going to be on, I think it was actually going to be around the 4th of July weekend in Denver, Colorado. And then they pulled the plug on that and delayed it until September. So then I ended up just going alone, and it was advertised as that RFK Jr. was going to be the big headliner of the convention, and then he at the last moment then pulled out for some reason, maybe because he had just endorsed Trump and gotten fully in bed with the endorsing or what he's calling like a partnership. He didn't end his campaign. He suspended his campaign, as we talked about last time, where he, in certain battleground states, he's staying on the he's getting off the ballot, and then he's staying on the ballot in non-battleground states. And so a lot of this is coalesce in many ways. A lot of this very quote unquote anti-establishment, third party politics, independent politics is really now coalescing behind what we really have been anticipating in terms of what the RFK Jr. campaign looked like it was being at the very least cultivated as, if not designed to be, as some kind of, flanking of Trump and a driving of people to Trump. And so this was then the nature of the event that I then attended. And I didn't quite know exactly what the deep political landscape was of the event. But I did know on the surface that this is very much in resonance with the kinds of political strategies that I think are important over the midterm to the long term of American politics, where, I gave a presentation at the Deep Truth Conference online, 2018, something like that, where I talked about full spectrum principled people power politics that introduced the idea of a transpartisan movement where it actually takes the idea of independent politics, including third party politics, and actually going all in on the questions of what are the principles and policies that can actually align the full spectrum of American politics in a deep and American way. And this sort of like almost is a flip of that in certain ways, because this was mainly predicated upon anti two-party politics and the logistical aspects of really focusing on anti two-party politics, or what they call the duopoly, or sometimes the uniparty, but usually the duopoly system, which we've talked about before, which does present itself as some kind of RICO type mob operation in terms of having occupied the levers of democratic power in the United States in terms of keeping people off of ballots, or controlling primaries, or controlling the voting systems in many ways, or controlling access to long form debates and all of that kind of thing. And so this movement, it's also being called the United Independent Movement. And so this is the actual strategic breakthrough of this that I see as potentially positive, is this idea of, let's not just start another party or third party. Let's actually, now that there has been this major growth of American citizens and voters who now identify as independent, or functionally independent, and it's probably almost doubled in percentage in what you might look at maybe the last 2 decades at least, or maybe even the last decade. It's gone from like 30% to now just being reported as having gone over 50%. So that was a big part of the pitch of this independent national convention, was to launch a united independent movement that was mainly against the duopoly, and was also attempting to create a coalition and a functional and logistical strategy of uniting the kinds of political powers that the duopoly has, the Democrats and the Republicans, in terms of access to money, access to ballots, access to media, and a coalition of like something like a slate across many different, not only states but also levels of government, from the federal level and the presidency down through the states and the local and the municipality, and actually create a functional coalition where technologies of voter targeting and voter outreach and resources, including money and media, were being pooled together, with the main thing being about transparency. Now, this is a buzzword, that more than 5 years ago we dissected as when it's not attached to accountability. Transparency just becomes a buzzword for things that sort of actually end up not having accountability, which is real whistleblowing, is the way we put it. So in this scenario, at the Independent National Convention of 2024, which was in Denver, Colorado, there was a 3-part principle of the actual functioning platform at this point in terms of united independence. One was transparency. Then they've added in accountability. That's a good thing. And then it's TAP. So it's transparency, accountability, and then participation. So participation, again, to me, is similar to transparency, where its participation can be anything. Like in the case of this conference or convention, it was a sort of a conference posing as a convention, because there was not actually any real convention work being done. There was very little discussion of the actual deep political issues, attempting to avoid a conflict of this full spectrum of people that were represented, from like the libertarians to sort of ex-Democrats and sort of leftists, and then sort of middle of the road people, and in favor of actually having this sort of process-based political platform. It's sort of a political platform without any political substance. It's a political platform about the mechanisms of politics and the mechanisms of democracy and representation, which is interesting. I think it's a piece of it, but I find the avoidance of the actual political substance to be telling, especially in relationship to this third plank of participatory. I've pointed out, like even at our local Lawrence City Commission, that the key word in terms of democracy in our system is not participation, because that can just be like, clicking on having your temperature taken, as they used to talk about it at like the Occupy Wall Street, Occupy LA. Let's take a temperature, and they would ask you to raise your hands about how you felt about what was going to be consented upon. And at this Independent National Convention, they were perpetually asking you to give your feedback about your sentiment, about how you felt about how things were going, how connected you felt, this kind of thing. But the word that's always left out that's crucial is deliberative. It's a very specific form of participation that goes way beyond just voting or having your temperature taken or doing polls or these kinds of things. It's actually the critical function that is protected under the First Amendment, that includes speech, press, assembly, religious conscience, petition for redress of grievances. It's the deliberative function that's the crucial piece of participation. And so now I get the sense, okay, we have accountability now is ensconced as important alongside so-called transparency. What we really want is truth, not just transparency. This goes back again to all these things we've talked about how you can flood the zone with tons of leaks and data, but if you can't make sense of it, if you can't understand intelligence, counterintelligence, the nature of the assault on sense making, the use of secrecy the use of both secrecy and release, such as limited hangouts, as a way of not only covering up or obscuring the truth, but also of dirtying up the truth, or even weaponizing the truth sometimes, in a way where the deeper reasons for the transparency are not being readily described. And so I went into this very open to the potency of this as a key piece of strategy that I think that we do need. I do think that we need to figure out how to coalesce this, now majority of the American political citizenry seeing themselves as independent, and seeing a major problem with the way that the two-party system has occupied our constitutional Republican form of deliberative democracy in this country. And so that piece is very important. But it was interesting. I had a few conversations along the way of like, well, why don't we, actually approach this in the sort of best of the anarchist type tradition, in terms of you overgrow the duopoly in many ways, meaning don't make it anti-partisan or anti-duopoly, make it transpartisan. So then you actually, instead of creating a sort of a democratic war of 51% independents versus 49% in these two parties, no, you start with the political substance and you create an ideas and policy platform that is big enough and is deep enough and is compelling enough in terms of its vision of what needs to be stopped and what needs to actually be done and created, that you actually make it impossible to deny within the two-party occupation of the system itself. And thus you then open the door to people who are going to continue to operate in both of these parties to actually sign on to the principles and policies that are also, then you're creating a flanking mechanism of this power structure that exists outside of this to this two-party duopoly system. And it just makes things happen much more effectively and much more rapidly. And one thing that was a problem here is that the founder of this movement, his name's Christopher Life. He did seem to put this forth as some kind of 2-decade project. Whereas there was a representative, I think from North Carolina, who'd actually been involved in winning a fairly independent approach to state level politics. And I think North Carolina, maybe South Carolina, I think North Carolina, who started the Alliance Party, who said that if you don't have a compelling notion of, you're saying we're facing these crises that includes war and peace, that includes ecological catastrophe, health catastrophe, and really governance catastrophe of some sort. If you don't have like this sense of urgency or a strategy that can actually do this in the time scheme that it needs to happen, then it begins to feel like a sort of a dissipative kind of participation. And it very likely will not, first of all, it's not up to the moment, to the crisis of the moment, and how, how rapidly we actually need to address a lot of this kind of stuff. But it also then creates a sense of like people dissipating over a period of time. And so there were sort of a few different pieces that I begin to understand of what was problematic around this, even though I resonate very much with some of the mission of this kind of movement. And of course, it gets into the substance of deep politics, such as what kind of narrative warfare is actually going on here? Who's backing this? Who are the players? What are they functionally actually setting up here in terms of our actual political moment right now, beyond these very massive pillars of recreating a political American revolution over the course of years to decades? And so I'll go quickly through some of the problems I immediately began to notice. One is that the Christopher Life, and it looks like a lot of his sort of support network, including some of the people that would come and do almost like ecumenical benedictions to begin the conference. And by the way, there was a lot of sort of spiritual overlay, and then also a lot of personal growth and a lot of breathing exercises and this kind of thing. Now, I think some of this stuff is very helpful in terms of like breathing exercises can be very helpful, but there was this sense of almost like I would say, using a spiritual overlay to avoid the criticality of the political substance of the moment.
Jeremy, would you maybe describe this as some kind of hybrid or variation of like a lot of this, maybe some of these elements of New Age thought that have really gotten brought into things like elements and aspects of QAnon, and then obviously post-COVID politics combined with like this particular strain of religious thought of self-help and prosperity and all this? Would you kind of describe it as that?
Very, very much so. There was this aspect of to me on the surface, just sort of culturally, it felt like a combination of what you might imagine like a mass Alcoholics Anonymous kind of meeting combined with Burning Man. And that was sort of like and this is very real too. RFK Jr. is Alcoholics Anonymous. That can, there's a lot of powerful personal growth stuff involved in Alcoholics Anonymous, but it is like any other kind of, you know, it can become like any other kind of cult in many ways. And so you begin to sort of sense some of that there. And then there was this whole Burning Man crypto bro overlay to the whole thing. And like there was a lot of people, a lot of these sort of maybe 20, 30-year-old guys who walked around looking like Brock Pierce to me. And Brock Pierce was also announced early on by Christopher Life. And what was the first thing I wanted to say? One of the backgrounds that Christopher Life has, that some of his sort of ecumenical, new agey kind of benediction folks also mentioned this, was there's a background with Barbara Marx Hubbard and creative evolution. And so there's some, some serious deep politics to get into in terms of that background that includes a very serious problems in terms of things that Barbara Marx Hubbard has said, has written in unpublished drafts of papers that include things like seems like she's actually echoing aspects of the Book of Revelations and turning it into some kind of singularity, techno-futurist, transhumanist kind of agenda about what's going to happen with the sort of quarter to third of the people who are not able to make the leap to the next level of consciousness, that seem to suggest a very crude, almost brutal kind of sense of almost like new age spiritual eugenics of the people who are not going to make it. It's not clear. Some of this stuff was not ultimately publicly published, but it seems to have been verified that it was written. And just on the surface of it, people can go look at some of the work, I believe, that John Brisson from We've Read the Documents has done in terms of this background of Barbara Marx Hubbard. So that was one thing that I noticed immediately, that this is definitely, in a similar kind of way that you might see something like an Edge sort of Epstein, Silicon Valley epicentered kind of conference. This had the feel and look of a network that came out of some of the Barbara Marx Hubbard circles, and so that alone is not enough for me to throw the whole baby out with the bathwater. In this case, I do think it needs to be reckoned with, and I would like to have a one-on-one conversation with Christopher Life, who in this convention was really running around a lot and really didn't seem to be very available to have a conversation, especially about concerns. But one thing that struck me is that then Christopher Life at some point real quickly and then glanced over it. And I'd noticed this right before I went to this convention, that Brock Pierce was going to have a role in this. Now he didn't actually end up being there, but he did give a zoomed in, very strange and sort of brutally emotional, where he's crying and talking like this really loudly with this blown out voice during the final evening presentations. And Brock Pierce is very much Epstein. That's he was said to have been, he went to Epstein's Island after the first arrest of Epstein. He was said to have been Epstein's crypto advisor. And by the way, just this morning, it was, I think, officially announced that Eric Adams, the mayor of New York, is facing an indictment for political corruption. And Eric Adams came onto the mayoral scene by basically calling Brock Pierce his crypto advisor and talking about getting his salary in crypto and all of that. But the thing that I then noticed was that even way more recently, within the last 10 years, but even just 2 years ago, Brock Pierce made this very strange run for Senate, I think, in Maine, and totally backed by Steve Bannon. Boris Epstein, I think, was part of it. So it was a very Trump-centric kind of run. Now, Christopher Life, in the one of his early presentations about the parameters of this movement and this convention and the reason for this event, did mention, he said that Brock Pierce was a co-founder of the Independent National Convention from last year. And he was also then given this sort of final night place to come in and give his message. So that, and then combining, so those two things, first, this Barbara Marx Hubbard background, this Brock Pierce involvement and background, and then finally this very RFK Jr. heavy aspect and networks that were deeply involved in all of this, all gave me a lot of pause to sort of unabashedly throw myself into this without like really getting a full lay of the land first. So I just want a couple other sort of details that I think might be important to note is that by the end of the event, it became clear that Christopher Life was like was almost not able to do this event because of lack of funding. And to me, it looks like the amount of weight that was put on RFK Jr. as this improvised independent candidate, and him being this crucial character to sort of give the big speech. And I believe they replaced RFK Jr. with Marianne Williamson. Now, I missed that because they got off schedule. They didn't have great communications about who was going to be when and where and all of that kind of thing. But it was pretty clear that this RFK Jr. endorsing Trump, right, sort of in the weeks run up to this event, was a major crisis for this entire movement, where there was this woman, Allie Katz, who became like maybe the major bridge funder for this event to happen. She does sort of like family trusts and sort of, family finance in a conscious manner. Seems to come out of this same kind of, Burning Man, New Age kind of circles. She seemed to have given bridge loans basically to Christopher Life to make this event happen, including like giving him wire transfers and running up all of her credit cards. And so there was even a bunch of debt, it looks like, in terms of just this event happening. And even she was given a sort of fairly prominent speaking positions and even little bits of advertisement for her business in terms of this convention. She said that after she sort of heard about this RFK Jr. Trump endorsement, she was thinking, well, forget all this political stuff. I'm moving to Costa Rica. And she said that it was Christopher Life's commitment to this independent national convention and this united independent movement that caused her to, be like, no, we're going to do this. We're going to continue to do this. So that to me is interesting. So I got a sense of that this Christopher Life and his attempt to create this movement was being actually compromised in many ways by RFK Jr. Now, it was self-compromised because he's obviously the decision maker. He's the one who sort of brought in RFK Jr. and that entire network to be the focal point of what's meant to be an independent movement. Remember, RFK Jr. did not start out as an independent, right? He was then rejected by the Democrats from running against an incumbent candidate. And they did lawfare and targeted him in the media and all of that. And but then he then moved into independent and was in a fairly sort of successful place in terms of ballot access and everything like that before he went ahead and endorsed Donald Trump. So this seems like a very shaky kind of thing. This is sort of to put this much emphasis and base so much of the legitimacy and the networks of involvement and support in what's meant to be an anti-partisan, almost at the very least, an anti-duopoly partisan movement into someone who is trying to run as a Democrat. It sounds sort of similar to like putting your hopes into Bernie Sanders or something like that to start your independent movement, even though Bernie Sanders is functional, is de jure an independent. So that was an issue there, and the RFK Jr. people were very prominent. And in fact, a lot of this seems to have then been a lot of the people who were put front and center here, including someone like Del Bigtree, who was RFK Jr.'s communications guy, who came in to continue. He did come in to give a presentation at this convention. A lot of this is now leading to what this weekend's events, which are the Rescue the Republic.
I was just about to mention Del Bigtree is one of the speakers at this Save the Republic, Rescue the Republic,
Rescue the Republic, yeah.
With the website address of jointheresistance.org with Donald Trump and a bunch of other figures on the reenacting George Washington crossing the Delaware.
Exactly. And you'll see Del Bigtree is involved in all of this, and there was this main musical artist called Deepak, who had written this Together We Will Rise song that it was said by Christopher Life at this convention to have been sort of instigated by him for last year's independent convention, as a song to represent the movement. And they played it many times. They sang it many times. It's a pretty catchy song. And I noted that Deepak and his song co-writer and co-performer had sung this at the InfoWars studios just maybe a month ago or something like that. But I've never seen this Deepak guy ever mention this United Independent Movement or this independent national convention, even though it's being said that he was sort of instigated to write this song as part of this independent movement. And instead, it seems like they were all just moving right on to this Join the Resistance, Rescue the Republic event that's going on this weekend, as you pointed out, Greg, with the masthead, the banner of this being a recreation of Washington crossing the Delaware with Trump as Washington surrounded. He's flanked by Jordan Peterson and Russell Brand, which that's interesting. Those are either one of them actually Americans? I don't know. Maybe they've gotten their citizenship now. We do know for sure that they're part of this very, very controlled and weaponized anti-establishment organizations where Russell Brand represents like the Rumble op, the Howard Lutnick very Israeli Russian centric Rumble operation. Russell Brand was maybe their key big guy. And then Jordan Peterson being brought into the Ben Shapiro, basically Israeli Unit 8200, very sort of Chinese intelligence, Israeli intelligence fold via the Wilkes brothers and their extractive fuel fortunes and their Yahwism, their Yahwist Christianity and all of that kind of thing. And then you have like Tulsi Gabbard, as you were pointing out. Elon Musk is like right behind Trump.
Speaking of people who, even if they have their citizenship, I would say are not representing American interests.
Right. So they're being sort of portrayed as this great second American political revolutionaries. And I think we know them to be not, if anything, maybe the opposite in certain ways, very related to clean break culture and terror wars in parallel. And really a sort of a destabilizing anti-American force, I would actually say, especially under the guise of MAGA as such. And it does seem to be that all of this just ultimately leads into forget about the actual functional American dynamics of actually getting back to a partisan RICO operation democratic system in terms of some of this very strategic work around united independent movement, and right into, RFK Jr. told us to vote for Trump, and now they're all going to gather to rescue the republic. And really, mainly what they're saying is they have all these planks of their platform, but the main thing is that it's Alex Jones, 40 days out, the most important election, or however many days, and you got to vote for Trump. And even Brett Weinstein and now Jimmy Dore has I believe Jimmy Dore is saying he's not going to vote. He's not going to vote for Trump, but he functionally at this point is an anyone but Kamala Harris kind of voice at this point.
Yeah.
And so Elon Musk is like right behind Trump as his advisor. So you could almost get it's hard to imagine a less really at the very least natural born American form of the next American Revolution here in terms of who's being portrayed, where Elon Musk is seems to be the one who's giving Trump sight about strategy or where we're going to go. And then you have Brett Weinstein and Robert Malone and Jimmy Dore and Heather Hiring, which is Brett Weinstein's wife, and Tulsi Gabbard and Lara Logan, and then Matt Taibbi. And then if you notice in the back ship, the Deepak, this writer of this song, is there right next to Douglas McGregor. In the back ship here. So this, on the surface here, this is not really a credible, patriotic American restoration or even American revolutionary kind of movement here at all. So at the very least, on the surface, the dynamics of what I was meant to be delivered into in terms of my deeper interest in a very valid and legitimate strategy of a united independent movement with strategies and campaign technology and all of that seems to be just delivered into another freaking Bannon op, and so, and I could have just my one data point of Brock Pierce being called the co-founder, the background with the Epstein and all of that. And by the way, there's an even deeper, darker background there with Brock Pierce in terms of his, when he was a child actor, and then he was part of this very sort of child abuse centric network of Hollywood producers and stuff like that. And now maybe Brock Pierce was a victim of all of this and became sort of part of this victimizing network. But, just 2 years ago, he's being backed by Boris Epstein and Steve Bannon. And so on the surface, I could have told you, just from our sort of original analysis based on research of RFK Jr.'s campaign being originally, at the very least, dog whistled by Steve Bannon and Roger Stone as really part of a MAGA flank operation, a Trump flank operation, combined with Brock Pierce and being backed by Steve Bannon, Boris Epstein. I could have just on those data points, I would have made a prediction that, this is just going to feed us into whatever this RFK Jr. Trump endorsement and this rescue the Republic BS is. And it looks to me like that really, at the very least, in terms of the functional surface of the characters that were involved in all of this, does seem to be the purpose. Now, I'm not going to write Christopher Life off just based on that. I still want to have a conversation, or I want our sort of like critical perspective to reach him and see how he might respond to all of that. But at the way that it stands right now, this is one big Bannon op, it looks like to me.
Yes, and this completely, I think, correlates with what we've been identifying over the past number of years. And I'm just thinking about a lot as you're talking there, and I'm thinking about the era of the era of politics that aforementioned, maybe pre-MAGA, pre-terror war era, pre-post era politics, where it's still, as you mentioned, like this ultimately, I think, insufficient and perhaps, if you wanted to say so, illegitimate, two-party monopoly, duopoly over our system. But it was still a political system that was, it was not a political system that was out, or political party-based politics system that was out to just completely things that are being advocated for now, like the destruction of the administrative state of politics, and just we're still still political bipartisanship. In the days of centrist, we talked about this. I think Trump represented this, and I think also even now, as you've seen in the Democratic Party, Bernie was an example of this, and others. But like the days of being on this center of politics, like a committed committed Democrat or Republican in terms of the way we would know them in the past. I think those days are over, and as you said, it's made way for more people to be identified as political independents. Then I'm also thinking about the trajectory of political movements that I think have helped pave the way for where we're at today over the last number of years. We had the anti-globalization movements of the 90s, which then you move into the 2000s, and you have the first Ron Paul presidential campaign, which leads into, I would say that led into two things, directly led into both the Tea Party, I think, to a much more obvious extent, but then also Occupy Wall Street, which a big part of that is even rooted in elements of End the Fed. Those types had a pretty significant presence within both of those movements. And then you move to 2016, and you have Trump, the quote "Make America Not So Great," but let's call it that anyway. Again. Campaign slogan, and also the Bernie Sanders movement. And I think we can go and we can look at a trajectory of even people like Steve Bannon, I think political or operatives like this, playing a major role in the steering of these movements. But I think where we've come to ultimately with all of these, in Trump, the rise of Trump is a big part of that's anti-globalization, and then also this weaponized term of anti-paleo neocons, maybe we could call them paleo neocon, neoliberal regime change wars, and as Tulsi Gabbard will call them in that term. It's a hybrid of those things. And then you even bring in the way that Bernie Sanders was treated, or a lot of people believe, I think understandably so, that Bernie Sanders and his supporters were treated by the Democratic Party in both 2016 and 2020. And what we see is that all of these disaffected blocks of our politics, there's a major void that I think the establishment politics, legacy media, maybe this old bipartisan era of politics is, and all that it represents, both the good and the bad, and there's some very bad about it, as we talked about in so many ways, have left a void to where it's being filled in by these Steve Bannon operative types and many others who then, all of these movements, I think, at least, or the big part of the energy from each of these has now been ultimately brought into at least Donald Trump MAGA adjacent politics. Whereas if you're not like an open supporter of Trump, well, at the very least, you see it's then you fall into like the anybody but the deep state Democrats who want to start World War III, and it's these areas where even if you're not overtly a Trump supporter, I think maybe you had some experiences with some people that from elements of, I think from maybe from past 9/11 circles who would fit this description. It's very much like this. Maybe not Trump's the greatest, but Trump might not be the greatest, but man, this deep state, bipartisan deep state Democratic apparatus has got to be stopped. And basically, maybe Trump isn't the greatest, but Kamala and what she represents and like the apparatus behind her is the worst. I think maybe that might be a way to put it. But all of these movements, for whatever anything related from going back to what we talked about at first, this anti-globalization movement, the the central bank and the Fed, which was obviously a huge plank of Ron Paul's, along with the end the wars and end all this foreign aid to support corrupt countries, and so many other issues, even post MAGA, we've talked about being brought in, like the COVID era and the whole scientific elements of that, which are manyfold, and then the woke wars of post 2020 woke wars, which do have an influence not just on Republicans but also on people who would have, I think, identified as Democrat, or maybe certainly not as like as as MAGA or hardcore Republican. There's a lot of influencers you could see even through like the Silicon Valley, some of the technocratic crowd, some of this crypto crowd, as you talked about here, which seems to bring in a lot of, even in the case of like a Brock Pierce, there's some significant Epstein network influence there. But so much of these energies, legitimate and otherwise, legitimate energies and then energies that get weaponized, have been brought into, if not overtly Trump, overtly MAGA, which is obviously where like certainly where a Steve Bannon falls, or I think some of these other significant political operatives fall who might be influencing movements like this. You can count RFK Jr. with that now with his endorsement of Trump, obviously. All of these energies have been taken and put in this direction, some more overtly than others, but I think that an event like this ultimately makes that point where it's either, yeah, Trump's not the greatest. We know what the big threat is, and it's what the other, it's the obviously the bipartisan hybrid Democratic deep state apparatus that wants to start World War III and bankrupt us and all this, and name any type of things. But yeah, we talked about this previously with like I guess you could maybe say the chicken's coming home to roost of like this void, political and societal void that has been filled in by these very, very, very bad players. And I think this is maybe a not as publicly visible version of it, but I think it ultimately, you could look at it at the end of the day, and ultimately it is a version of this, and it just all this energy though, and like that's an area where I think that's probably maybe the biggest area that where Trump is still where you could have really, if like say maybe some Democrats had even tried to, maybe not even sufficiently, but even tried to like maybe fill in some of these voids and address some of the concerns from any number of issues. Obviously we talked about Israel Palestine right front and center, but there's a lot of other issues. It relates to the scientific freedom, it relates to food safety, it relates to any number of issues that could have been taken advantage of but are not being. And now the void, I think, is almost just about entirely filled by straight up MAGA, straight up like oligarchical on a national and international scale, MAGA politics or MAGA or some type of adjacent politics to where your issues have been weaponized and brought directly into these circles. I just see it all over the board, and I don't really see a lot of exceptions.
I think you're correct, and this is one of the reasons why I think that this kind of political thinking of like how to actually regenerate, I might call it regenerative politics, and similarly to regenerative agriculture, and which was good at this event. There was a strong focus on the actual specifics and politics of regenerative agriculture and how it fits directly in with human health and ecological health, and ultimately like political health in terms of a lot of the big oligarchical money in relationship to the food system and all of that. But there is this problem where, especially I would say in reaction to deep events, deep events that have political reverberations, or at least some original substance, that in the middle, when people do not have a good sense of like the larger landscape, or even the deeper epistemological landscape, such as one of the conversations that I had as almost like became a theme actually of the conference with one of this very long-standing and I think very honest local leader of the 9/11 truth movement, was this concept that I've talked about a little bit of reactionary epistemology. And reaction, of course, happens when something is done. You could almost say that reaction is at the origins of something like the shock doctrine, right? That is one way of using shock events, traumatic events, deep events, is to provoke reaction, rather than, I would say, response. Because it's not like you can just ignore, you can't ignore deep events, But if you're only reactive, then you get very easily become susceptible to reactionary epistemology, which means that, we've talked about this before, that once you begin to get a sense of, okay, the media and the politicians are almost to a one lying about basic physics, let's say, of ground zero and the way that buildings came down, the way that over 1,000 human bodies were totally destroyed on September 11th, for example. You can then very quickly, if you're not prepared to be responsive rather than reactive, you can very quickly spin out into, well, CNN tells me that the earth is round, thus it must be flat. Or CNN tells me that the sky is blue, thus the sky must be orange, or something like that. Or the sky is red. Or, you can or like CNN tells me that there is a virus, thus the viruses don't exist. And so this kind of reactionary epistemology is utilized in relationship to these kinds of deep instigated events, right? And so in the 21st century, I think we can really look at some key, moments. Of course, the launching of the 21st century, the so-called New American Century, September 11th, and then the entirety of the endless wars, as they talk about it now, but the terror wars that we've talked, or clean break wars that we talked about it very specifically and factually. And then I could even say you could throw in the 2004 elections, which of any election that we've had in the 21st century seems to have the most factual substance for there to actually being a high level of compromising and ultimately decisive election fraud, mainly running out of the Rove, Manafort, we may say, Ken Blackwell, CNP networks surrounding Ohio and all of that, but very likely much larger. And so those are still some of the kind of questions that come in later on when that sort of deep political event is not quite unpacked and digested. We then see what happens, and I think the unanswered questions of 2016 in swing states, and then definitely this very Bannon, Trump, Roger Stone style, just straight up deceptive operation that they basically signaled. Bannon was caught on recording, as we talked about, signaling that if it was close enough, Trump, whether or not there was substantial fraud in the election, was going to accuse of fraud. And what did we see? Just exactly that. So that's another good example of where John Kerry in 2004 admits 10 years later on NPR that they had questions inside of the campaign, or they actually had facts that they believed that about that election and election fraud, that they didn't think that they had quite enough standing to be able to pursue. And ultimately they didn't want to upend the American system in the way then that vacuum creates a situation for the very deceptive and weaponized, I would say very anti-American, at root seditious types, the anti-establishment types surrounding Trump and Bannon and Stone and MAGA and all that, to come into this vacuum created by that Democratic establishment ultimately, and then totally sort of lie on it and deceive on it and get everybody caught up in reactionary epistemology on that. And so I think there's a few other events that we might point to. One of them you mentioned before, which was like the rise of things like the Tea Party and Occupy Wall Street, in many ways were a response that in certain ways became a reaction to the 2008 financial crisis, which I believe was also a deep political event. And then you can get into 11/9 Operation 2016. Then you can get into obviously 2020, but then also the launch of the 3/11, the COVID reaction operation, which then had followed on the actual COVID operation itself, which is still going on. Really, it's still going on, and now the sort of the establishment that sought to sort of use the reaction to that in a way that was very, very oppressive and tyrannical, while bolstering up the plutocratic and oligarchical forces in the United States, have now sort of taken the opposite. They're trying to cover up that the COVID is still ongoing. And then I think you then finish up into like things like this post October 7th as this key deep event.
Legacy media lies and misleads and misinforms on some important matters, sometimes based on omission, sometimes deliberately and knowingly. So therefore, anytime anybody says that Donald Trump might present a threat to our our future stability as a politically and socially, all the way to there's a virus that people should take seriously, all the way to Ukraine should be supported against an aggressive neighbor that also is actually directly undermining our own political system. All those things become untrue, and all those things become basically the equivalent of saying that the sky is red rather than blue, and that's where and I think that you laid out this the reactionary mindset very well.
And there's a thing that I began to notice too, that it's, there are those, and this was talked about at the convention. I talked about this with um, the 9/11 Truth leader about, there are those who maybe I would call them post COVID 3/11 truthers or something like that, who go from, sort of going along with most narratives to some extent to then being like, well, viruses don't exist within like, a year or two or something like that. So there's that kind of really intense, like I would call epistemological reactionary tendencies, which are people responding to both the actual literal trauma of a global biowarfare apparent operation and the apparently weaponized global reaction to that, and all of that. And then very quickly, because of then finding out that, father government and mother media are lying to you about this, that's then an additional layer of trauma on top of this original trauma, that certain, types, people who are very smart in many other ways, can then very quickly be almost be regressive in a certain way by seeking shelter of surety in relationship to reactionary epistemology. But then there are those who are very much more careful over time, who are not psychologically driven to like real, more crude reactionary epistemology, who I believe actually learn how to tread water within a reactionary epistemological sort of anti-sense making apparatus. And so those are the sort of, types that will then sort of see someone like begin to get their sense of like what of Russiagate, not even understand like 11/9 itself as a deep operation, and then imagine that Jimmy Dore is the type that's going to give you the reality of Russiagate, a conspiracy theory or something like that. Like we took on James Corbett for basically having done, and it's almost like the sort of opposite of what he did for 9/11, a conspiracy theory, for what we would have called 11/9, a conspiracy theory, but he called it maybe Russiagate, a conspiracy theory. So instead of actually calling into question the limited hangout or the red herring of the official narrative and going deeper behind it and to see what actually all was going on, who all was involved, it's basically, well, there's nothing there, and that this is just sort of like a totally made up thing. And by the way, this all comes in temporal parallel fashion with Jimmy Dore now stepping out as like a leading 9/11 truth advocate, and including like beginning to have, 9/11 truth advocates onto his show, making this joke that everybody points to now about, oh, you think a plane brought down Building 7? I have a vaccine to sell you.
He's yeah, like Tucker Carlson having evolution on September 11th as well, supposedly. Yeah.
Well, isn't it interesting that actually Tucker Carlson was ahead of Jimmy Dore in terms of like beginning to sort of step away from his anti 9/11 truth scenario? And, as we pointed out, we've dissected both of these guys, and including in their relationship to 9/11 truth, right? We pointed out, we made a show after, I think it was after the Mueller report was finally released by Bill Barr with this very deceptive preamble that then you had Donald Trump Jr. saying collusion truthers. Whereas if you actually sort of like read through all these documents, there's a lot of collusion. There's a lot of conspiracy in many ways. Read Seth Abramson's book, Proof of Conspiracy, the second one. And then we saw that Jimmy Dore, at the very sort of similar time, we caught Jimmy Dore basically responding maybe to a super chat in a live stream that then got deleted from YouTube. That is something about 9/11 and the buildings, maybe the celebrating Israelis, and Jimmy Dore basically saying Noam Chomsky says there's nothing there. If Noam Chomsky says there's nothing there, then that's what I'm going with. So that's a perfect example for someone, I think, who's maybe like treading quote unquote thought leader for those that are sort of treading water in the middle of the wake of deep politics that they don't even know happened. Like people who are not even aware that 11/9, the Trump MAGA, is actually represents the twin pillar of this this 21st century post 9/11 era to the terror wars and the clean break culture wars, and that these are all part of a very deeply embedded operation of deep politics inside of the United States, and very similar to 9/11, both international and transnational in many ways. And sure, you're not going to get you're definitely not going to get the much of the truth, let alone the whole truth, from the CNNs, the MSNBCs, or even the Fox Newses. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing there. And in fact, you have to do work. You have to swim. You can't just tread water. You have to swim, try to figure out where the truth is, and then swim towards it. It takes active effort. But if you don't know that you're swimming in, putrid water, potentially created by types like Bannons and Stones who like to flood the zone with excrement, then you don't know that you need to get to cleaner waters.
Yes, and as we start to wrap up this recording here, that's I would say one of the biggest problems. I don't know if it's the biggest problem, but it's definitely right up there as one of the biggest problems with having the likes of Tucker Carlson and Steve Bannon and Roger Stone serving as major influence peddlers and thought leaders of some type or another. You could use air quotes around that, of course, but they're considered that within a lot of these elements of what makes up MAGA 2.0, MAGA, MAHA, whatever you want to call it, both direct and adjacent terms politically, is that certainly in the case of foreign policy, certainly in the case of geopolitics around September 11th and the post 9/11 world, and anything surrounding these weaponized rhetoric of ending the regime change wars and all of this, and getting the neocon hawks out and all of this, and their democratic counterparts, is where you can very much see that underneath that it actually benefits the people who I think you can credibly look at as being largely responsible for making an event such as September 11th happen. Certainly Donald Trump, with his relationships with people on the ground in New York City, all the way from the very, very inappropriately nicknamed America's mayor to Bernard Kerik, all the way to various people within the financial community in New York, within various communities, and then and et cetera, et cetera. We laid out how much of a connection Trump had to actual people actually that you could look at with the New York operation of September 11th more than pretty much any modern political, certainly at the presidential level politics that we could think of. And then obviously you've got to take the case of Steve Bannon with literally comes from running a media outlet that was conceived in Israel at a table with Prime Minister, whatever you want to call him, Benjamin Netanyahu. And these are the people who are now committed to getting us. You get the Roger Stone in there as well, of course, with his significant background. It's still the same Roger Stone who did yeoman's work for Bush 2000 with the Brooks Brothers riot and other events, and helped bring down Elliot Spitzer on behalf of some of his international business mafia criminal syndicate interests. That same person, but now these are the people who have been tasked with, or that the people are putting trust in, just differing levels. They're going to bring us the truth about everything from the origins of COVID and how viruses either don't exist or are being lied about, all the way to who brought the towers down and who killed John F. Kennedy and all these deep political events. And at this level, you can see it's the people that are that also you can see at the end of the day how these types are actually well connected to types of people and interests that, if not actually pulling off these events, have cui bono stand to benefit from the continued the continuity of the events that have followed these things. So, I mean, I think this is one of the biggest dangers of these voids being filled by these actors, is that, in many cases, it's being served by people who are going to they're being filled by people who are going to directly serve the interest of the actual networks that pulled off a lot of these deep political crimes that they are now professing themselves to be the people that are going to expose them and stop them from happening again in the future.
These are very important points, Greg, that you're making here, because, if let's get particular about this, you talked about Donald Trump and, very much, as we've analyzed, connected to the New York real estate and very Netanyahu Israeli tied in real estate mob that were at the epicenter, literally, geographically, World Trade Center, ground zero of the 9/11 operations in terms of this whole network. And who is it? Steve Witkoff, right? Steve Witkoff actually named in some of these leaked Able Danger type of documents as being at the epicenter of aspects of the Bernie Kerik Israel connection. Right, Steve Witkoff golfing with Trump during this, with this second alleged assassination attempt goes on, and then you have people like Ryan Dawson basically getting this from a source live on a space and saying, "Oh, that's probably Witkoff is probably the one who set Trump up. He's the one who indicated their location and all of that kind of thing." Now, meanwhile, Witkoff, as we've pointed out, is deep Trump from way back, 2016, way back before that, back to 9/11. There's a Trump Witkoff, they're in the network together. And then Witkoff is actually on Trump. I think he's leading the Trump transition group this time. And so this is at the epicenter from 9/11 to 11/9. As we analyzed, well over half a decade ago. And this continues to be the case, that these people are at the epicenter of this. And so if you actually look at the speaker makeup of this Rescue the Republic at Join the Resistance, oh my gosh, really. I mean, how Marxist can you get by talking about Join the Resistance and all of that? So this is all Steve Bannon style co-optation of language and all of that. If you go look at these speakers, I don't think you can find there's not a serious 9/11 truth teller. There's definitely not a serious 9/11 in Israel truth teller. There's barely a sort of like a Zionist critical kind of truth teller, let alone Jewish power critical or analyst kind of truth teller in all of this. In fact, the thing looks almost like the opposite of that. Like maybe the closest you could say that this exists is maybe No, you can't say that about Charlie Kirk. You can't say that about Tulsi Gabbard. You can't say that about Brett Weinstein. You can't say that about RFK Jr. You can't say that about Russell Brand. You can't say that about Jordan Peterson. I don't even think you can say that about Del Bigtree. Definitely can't say that about Jack Posobiec. Definitely can't say that about Senator Ron Johnson. Maybe you could say, okay, Colonel Douglas McGregor is flirting with a little bit of anti-Israel sentiment, well after the fact in a way that's highly controlled, highly weaponized. It does seem to serve Russian interests very often. And then maybe Jimmy Dore, like now he's sort of, getting woke on the Zionism question post October 7th or something like that. Maybe he's going to make his way to Israel in 9/11 or something like that. I'm sure in a very weaponized and controlled manner. But other than that, this is a very, Netanyahu's happy with this
Jeremy?
panel here. Yeah.
Jeremy, here's how Jimmy Dore's going to take it up. What does Kamala Harris, or I don't know if he'd say Kamala or actually call her by her proper name, Kamala, what does Harris know about Willie Brown not flying since she had a relationship with him?
Yeah, shouldn't have Kamala Harris have gotten the warning after all she did on her knees?
Yeah, there'd be those kind of things.
Willie Brown. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I'm joking, but I might actually be right. But anyway, go ahead.
You might be right. I can see that emerging.
And then you bring up some kind of connection between some type of military-industrial complex thing and Willie Brown and Harris. Anyway, I digress. But
And then you go to this other event that's being sort of stacked together with this, which is the sort of Rage Against the War Machine Part 2, and it becomes way more libertarian and way more directly Russian, I would say. You have Angela McArdle, who's head of the Libertarian Party. The head also comes out of the Libertarian Mises Caucus, as I call them. Clint Russell, Josie, the redheaded Libertarian, and then you have this whole, Jose Vega, Diane Sarr, very LaRouche element that seems to be very, very Russian in its recent scenario. And then maybe you have Ian Carroll, who might be the one person in all this who would talk about some aspects of Jewish power, Israel, deep Zionist politics, and all of that. But he's already basically shown himself to be very limited, very weaponized, and being promoted by the same kind of networks.
Even the problematic, for many, many reasons that we can identify, actual anti-Israel, critical of Israeli policy speakers from last year's event are mostly not represented this year. So,
right. So they've sort of shored this up to become a very RFK Jr. Libertarian Party backing of Trump pump and dump operation, right? Remember, like the libertarians have gotten on board here with RFK Jr. and Trump because they showed up to their convention, and then there's supposedly a backroom handshake of some sort with Angela McArdle that if the libertarians and this is what's happening. Angela McArdle's basically telling the Libertarian Party not to vote for their own candidate that was voted for in their actual convention and primary, but to vote for Donald Trump ultimately. And she's saying, well, they promise us a real libertarian in the administration, and maybe we'll have a hope at taking down the deep state, the administrative state, the Department of Education. And so all of this is now bubbling up too, as you're seeing. And a couple last things I want to point out before we finish, Greg. In the run up to this Independent National Convention, which I'll continue to try to digest and dissect and analyze moving forward, that there was this big all-in podcast, right? The sort of the PayPal mafia types who are now really sort of, other than maybe Jason Calacanis, I think they all seem to be sort of lining up behind Trump. And they had this big convention down at UCLA, and one of the long form conversations they had was with Jeffrey Sachs and John Mearsheimer. And I think it was Chamath Palihapitiya, who, by the way, just went on the Joe Rogan show, who asked, I hear a lot about this, the deep state. What is the deep state? Jeffrey Sachs sort of avoids it, and then Mearsheimer sort of goes in and basically says, it's the administrative state. All right, so now you have what's said to be the most prominent, most legitimate realpolitik, realist political pundit in the world, definitely from an American perspective, John Mearsheimer, just mimicking anti-factual, sort of dishonest, deceptive rhetoric around the long history of the development of the deep state as a concept, of deep politics as an area of study, especially by someone like Peter Dale Scott, really the academic dean of deep politics, very precise in terms of analyzing what the deep state is. And it's not the administrative state. But now you have John Mearsheimer. And by the way, there's this whole background that we're becoming familiar of with John Mearsheimer. He's probably not sort of become like a key, very narrative warfare Putin-esque, especially in his post-Ukraine war rhetoric. He didn't just sort of like fall into this. No, it turns out he was cultivated. His work was cultivated at the Valdai Club. He was then brought in. Then he was also then paid to go. It looks like he was paid to go give a presentation and visit directly with Viktor Orban, which he doesn't want to talk about with American journalists. and so now you have him very publicly at one of this podcast, the All In podcast, is like one of the biggest podcasts now in the world. And it's it's where you get RFK Jr. really making a big splash into podcasts for his campaign. You have all of these major Republican candidates going on there. Trump even went on there. And on their sort of big convention, you have John Mearsheimer basically mimicking sort of dishonest, very deceptive language that totally plays into a Bannon-Trump operation of equating the deep state with the administrative state.
And that's a great point, because we've identified this with other people. Like, I think we've identified this with Naomi Wolf and many other cases of this. But it's an example of where over time, and there's obviously some issues with the maybe with this cultivation of a John Mearsheimer, but over time, people like Naomi Wolf in many cases, and Mearsheimer in other cases, like they maybe in the case of Naomi Wolf, I think is more in terms of really coming around on a couple of issues of legitimacy, of legitimate concern about as far as how it's being treated within maybe mainstream discourse, or that maybe how Democrats treat it, or whatever, legacy media. And then Naomi Wolf becomes like parroting all these different talking points. It's not like the things that Naomi Wolf has like been concerned about over the decades is really being brought into if it is, it's being very weaponized. But over time, you see these people becoming more of that in more ways, in terms rhetorically and otherwise. And now John Mearsheimer, who I think at one point, even probably when he got a lot of criticism for co-writing the Israel Lobby and U.S. foreign policy book, was, I think, viewed as a foreign policy realist, probably be viewed as like some type of intellectual, institutional, probably political centrist of some kind or another, is now parroting the administrative state is the problem and is the deep state, and playing right into this of the people who really want to, I think, really put the screws to the American system of government, rather than trying to salvage it in a positive way by just getting rid of, in the name of lack of loyalty, say to Trump or MAGA policies, the name of people who actually represent serious American state interests, some more legitimate than others, but just getting rid of the people who hold the government together as far as from a means of help, all the way from helping people to carrying out daily functions of things. And now, John Mearsheimer, who may have been this respected foreign policy realist, centrist academic figure, now is like that, completely parroting these lines. So you become more and more of these as time goes on. There's not like a positive influence, like in terms of maybe the areas that Naomi Wolf was concerned about years ago that are of some legitimacy, but instead they just get interwoven into these very worse than problematic figures and what they're pushing and promoting.
All right. So as we finish up here, we will continue on next time with our perspectives of this deep political landscape from now into the future, by focusing more, rather than the domestic side of things, toward the international side of things, war and peace, questions of what's going on in Gaza, Israel, Lebanon, this massive what we probably would call a Hugint attack, a human intelligence combined with SIGINT cyber attack that Israel did against Lebanese, focused around Hezbollah and packing sort of consumer devices with explosives and then apparently lighting them via probably driving the battery via cyber attack, and all of that to a place where even, member of the American deep state, former head of chief of of CIA, Leon Panetta, called a terrorist attack. Leon Panetta called it basically this is a terrorist attack that Israel perpetrated in open space in Lebanon. So you have all of that going on, and then you have the questions of Trump talking about Iran more in terms of being behind his series of attempted assassinations allegations, and all of that, the nature of the background of the second alleged assassin, and what that seems to say in relationship to Ukraine and Russia and those Putin dynamics, and all of that. And so we'll cover a lot of that, and then I just want to point out that we were beginning to do this inquiry into the doppelganger question. Naomi Klein releases her book, A Doppelganger, and a lot of the narrative is related to Naomi Wolf and how people confuse her with Naomi Klein. And we were beginning to develop I would say a fairly deep critical analysis of this entire informational and narrative warfare terrain. And then boom goes October 7th, and we get into an even deeper, way more violent kind of arena, and an attempted national genocide with there's probably hundreds of thousands of Palestinian casualties in Gaza as it begins to come to the surface. And now Netanyahu is making it clear that he wants to escalate north into Lebanon, even though there are very substantial elements of the American-French alliance, let's say, that are working hard to pull together with Iran, and it sounds like Hamas and Hezbollah, to actually create a substantial ceasefire, at least for now, and Netanyahu indicating that he's against this. And so I just want to point out that from the year to the year of our first conversation about doppelganger, you then have the release of the doppelganger indictment by the U.S. government, that really, although so much attention has been put on this Tenet question and the multi-million-dollar slush fund poured into what we sort of saw as the usual suspects in terms of a very reactionary epistemology, very Putin, Netanyahu, Axis-serving kind of alt media on the right of this Tenet media operation. And there's been very little attention pointed toward the doppelganger indictment, which is hundreds of pages long, and it gives a lot of insight, especially in a follow-up to the 11/9 operation, and especially in terms of a post-10/7 environment, about what kind of actual Russian deep state information operations are being waged right now. And it really goes a long way to explain a lot of what we're seeing being amplified and boosted in a post-Elon Twitter environment, for all the way from the hardcore, like Jewish supremacist Zionist forces totally in bed behind a Netanyahu operation in a full-on horseshoe with like the anti-Jewish and sort of like the Jewish problem woke elements that are increasing in rapidity in a so-called response to the post-10/7 environment. And you can see a lot of the information warfare dynamics by just looking into a little bit of that doppelganger. So as we pointed out, from 100 years, a century, between Jabotinsky's Iron Wall to a post-10/7 Zionist regime Operation Iron Swords, in terms of the Nakba 2.0, trying to finish the original Nakba operation of the founding of the country, but this time as an alleged response to a Hamas terror attack, very obviously de facto facilitated by the Netanyahu regime in the long term and the short term, and the security and intelligence stand downs, the application and deployment of the mass Hannibal directive that ultimately amplified the Israeli casualties on October 7th. And so you have this 100-year cycle from Jabotinsky's Iron Wall to Netanyahu's Operation Iron Swords, but you also then have this sort of year cycle that I think we were seeing pop up between the release of Naomi Klein's doppelganger with a substantial amount about Naomi Wolf and her role with Steve Bannon's War Room, to now the release of the doppelganger Russian deep state information warfare documents that help explain the use of the post-10/7 environment as part of the twin pillars of the clean break terror wars and clean break culture wars, especially penetrating and focused against the American body politic. And so there's so much depth to this current environment that I think we just have to continue to really sort of get beneath the surface a little bit, figure out whether we're swimming in polluted waters, whether we're waters polluted by the Bannon and Stone political poison merchant excrement outsource types, or whether we need to swim towards cleaner waters, and or then what kind of political soil are we standing on, and what can be actually done to rectify that situation that goes way beyond the deployment of these sort of basic kind of policies of, transparency, accountability, and participation, even if it's just pushing a button on your iPhone kind of participation, to where we get to actual truth, accountability, restitution, reconciliation, and deliberative democratic participation in a rejuvenated, regenerative politics and rejuvenative soil of our current moment.
Indeed. And I think with that, we will wrap up, and we'll be back with a part 2 here pretty soon.
All right. Thank you very much, Greg, for doing this. We will reconnect soon. And thank you, everybody out there hanging with us. We appreciate you. Until next time, AnteDote, we are out.